Tonight, what we are witnessing is as audacious as it is psychologically devastating. The Lubyanka building, that notorious yellow brick fortress in the heart of Moscow that has housed Russian state security services since Stalin's NKVD tortured dissidents in its basement, has been struck by Ukrainian drones. Not struck metaphorically or symbolically, actually struck with explosive devices. In Moscow, less than 2 kilometers from the Kremlin walls, the headquarters of the FSB, Putin's primary instrument of domestic control, the successor organization to the KGB that Putin himself once led, has been attacked by the very country Russia invaded, claiming it would conquer in days. The building where Putin consolidated his power, where he planned the invasion of Ukraine, where his security services coordinate surveillance and repression of Russian citizens, now bears physical damage from Ukrainian military action that demonstrates no target in Moscow is beyond Ukrainian reach. Imagine this: FSB directors gathering for morning briefings in a building that's supposed to be the most secure location in Russia, suddenly hearing explosions, feeling the structure shake, evacuating through corridors where predecessors tortured political prisoners for generations. Picture Ukrainian military planners reviewing strike footage showing drones successfully navigating Moscow's air defense network to hit the symbolic and operational heart of Russian state power. Visualize Putin receiving reports that the FSB headquarters, the institution most responsible for ensuring regime security, cannot ensure its own security from Ukrainian attacks. Sounds like the complete inversion of the power relationship that was supposed to exist between nuclear superpower Russia and smaller neighbor Ukraine. But tonight, as debris is cleared from Lubyanka's courtyard and Russian security services scramble to explain how Ukrainian drones reached central Moscow undetected, this inversion is undeniable operational reality. What we are witnessing is not random terrorism or desperate lashing out. It is the culmination of Ukrainian psychological warfare strategy designed to demonstrate that Putin's regime cannot protect its most important institutions, that Moscow itself is a battlefield where Ukrainian forces can strike targets previously considered absolutely secure, that the apparatus of state control Putin has built over 2 decades is vulnerable in ways that undermine its fundamental purpose. Ukraine has effectively said, your security services cannot secure even themselves. Your capital is not sanctuary. Your power structures are targets we can reach whenever we choose. That's not empty rhetoric. That's demonstrated capability backed by physical damage to one of Russia's most symbolically important buildings. Think about that. For over a century, the Lubyanka has represented untouchable state power, the place where dissidents disappeared, where plots were uncovered, where threats to the regime were eliminated. Under Stalin's NKVD, under Khrushchev's and Brezhnev's KGB, under Putin's FSB, the Lubyanka symbolized that the security services saw everything, knew everything, controlled everything. No organization in Russia was more associated with invincibility, with the regime's capacity to protect itself and destroy its enemies. And yet, here we are, watching Ukrainian drones strike the building that houses the very organization responsible for preventing exactly such attacks. The symbolism couldn't be more devastating if Ukrainian planners had spent years crafting it. Here's the first hook. When your security headquarters is successfully attacked by the enemy you're supposed to be defeating, when the institution responsible for regime protection cannot protect itself, you haven't just suffered embarrassing tactical failure. You've experienced fundamental collapse of the mythology that sustains authoritarian power, the belief that state security apparatus is omniscient, omnipotent, and invulnerable. That mythology, like the Lubyanka's damaged walls, has been shattered beyond repair. This is not about one building being struck. It's about the systematic revelation that Putin's regime cannot provide basic security even for its most critical institutions in the capital city, that Ukrainian intelligence has penetrated Moscow's defenses so thoroughly that coordinated strikes on symbolic targets are operationally feasible, that the apparatus of state control is so degraded it cannot accomplish its primary mission of protecting the regime from external and internal threats. Ukraine has effectively demonstrated that the FSB, for all its surveillance capabilities and repressive power, is hollow when facing determined external adversary with innovative capabilities. For over 100 years, the Lubyanka building has occupied a unique and absolutely terrifying place in Russian consciousness and historical memory. The imposing yellow brick structure at Lubyanka Square in central Moscow has housed state security organs continuously since immediately after the Bolshevik Revolution, serving first as headquarters for the Cheka under Lenin's direction, then the notorious NKVD under Stalin's brutal reign, the powerful and pervasive KGB throughout the entire Soviet era, and finally the FSB after Soviet collapse in 1991. The building's infamous basement contained sophisticated torture chambers and execution cells where countless thousands of Soviet citizens, perhaps hundreds of thousands across the decades, met brutal ends during Stalin's Great Terror and subsequent waves of repression. The mere mention of Lubyanka was enough to instill paralyzing fear in Soviet citizens who understood through whispered stories and disappeared neighbors that summons to the building often meant permanent disappearance, lengthy imprisonment in the Gulag system, or immediate execution in the basement cells. The architecture itself was designed to intimidate. The building's neo-Baroque facade presents an imposing face to Moscow, while its internal structure was optimized for security service operations, including surveillance, interrogation, detention, and coordination of operations throughout the Soviet Union and abroad. Multiple wings radiate from a central core, creating a layout that maximized security and compartmentalization of sensitive operations. The basement levels extend deep underground, containing not just the notorious torture chambers and execution cells, but also archives of secrets gathered over decades of operations, command centers for coordinating nationwide repression, and holding cells where prisoners awaited interrogation or worse. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, there were genuine and widespread hopes among Russian Democrats and reformers that the Lubyanka would be fundamentally transformed, perhaps converted into a museum documenting the extensive crimes committed within its walls over 7 decades, a solemn memorial to the millions of victims of state terror who passed through its doors, a symbol of Russia's democratic transformation and rejection of authoritarian practices. Some activists proposed demolishing the building entirely, arguing that it represented such concentrated evil that it should not remain standing. Instead, under Putin's leadership starting in the late 1990s and continuing through his consolidation of power in the early 2000s, the FSB not only retained the building but actually expanded its operations there, renovating facilities, adding modern surveillance technology, and re-establishing the Lubyanka as the nerve center of Russian state security operations. Putin, who served in the KGB for 16 years and considers his intelligence service background absolutely formative to his worldview and approach to governance, deliberately maintained and enhanced the Lubyanka's symbolic importance. He understood instinctively that the building's historical associations with unchecked state power and systematic repression served his authoritarian project perfectly, that maintaining security services in the same location where Stalin's NKVD operated sent deliberate and unmistakable messages about continuity with Soviet power structures and methods. Throughout Putin's rule, the Lubyanka has served as operational headquarters for FSB activities that sustain his regime. The building houses departments responsible for counterintelligence operations against foreign intelligence services, surveillance of Russian citizens deemed potentially disloyal, investigation of political opposition, coordination with regional FSB offices throughout Russia, and planning of foreign operations including assassinations of regime enemies abroad. When opposition leader Alexei Navalny was poisoned with Novichok nerve agent, FSB officers likely received their operational orders from the Lubyanka. When Russian agents attempted to assassinate Sergei Skripal in Britain, the operation was likely coordinated from this building. The Lubyanka represents the operational heart of Putin's security state. Think about that. Ukraine chose to strike the building that most completely embodies Putin's authoritarian control, the institution most directly responsible for planning and executing operations against Ukrainian sovereignty, the organization that coordinated intelligence operations supporting Russia's invasion. The targeting was not random or symbolic gesture, but deliberate selection of a target whose successful strike would deliver maximum psychological and political impact while demonstrating Ukrainian capabilities in the most undeniable terms possible. For nearly 3 years, Ukrainian intelligence and special operations forces have systematically and methodically expanded their operational reach deep into Russian territory, striking targets with increasing boldness, sophistication, and devastating effectiveness. Early in the war, during spring and summer 2022, Ukrainian operations inside Russia were necessarily limited to border regions within range of conventional artillery and focused primarily on military targets like supply depots, command posts, and troop concentrations immediately supporting Russian invasion forces. By late 2022, Ukrainian capabilities had expanded significantly to include strikes using modified commercial drones and limited quantities of Western-provided missiles to hit targets deeper inside Russia, including military installations, ammunition storage facilities, and fuel depots located hundreds of kilometers from Ukrainian-controlled territory. Throughout 2023, the range, precision, and effectiveness of Ukrainian strikes increased exponentially and dramatically as Ukraine developed increasingly sophisticated indigenous long-range drone technology, received additional Western weapon systems with explicit or implicit permission for use against Russian territory, and built intelligence networks inside Russia that provided targeting information previously unavailable. By 2024, Ukrainian strikes were hitting targets throughout Western Russia with regularity and precision that Russian air defenses seemed utterly unable to prevent, despite Moscow's repeated claims of shooting down hundreds of drones and upgrading defensive systems. Oil refineries critical to fuel production, military airfields housing bombers that strike Ukrainian cities, command centers coordinating operations in occupied territories, and logistics hubs sustaining Russian forces were struck with increasing frequency, accuracy, and devastating effectiveness. Each successful strike demonstrated Ukrainian operational maturity, Russian defensive inadequacy, and the systematic expansion of Ukrainian capabilities that Russian military planners seemed powerless to counter. But the Lubyanka strike represents a qualitative leap far beyond previous operations in terms of target selection, operational difficulty, political significance, and psychological impact. Striking military or industrial targets is one thing, serious but within conventional parameters of modern warfare. Striking the headquarters of state security services in central Moscow is categorically different and operates at an entirely new level in terms of operational difficulty, political significance, and psychological impact on the Russian leadership and population. The operational planning required for the Lubyanka strike was extraordinarily complex and revealed capabilities that should deeply concern Russian leadership. Ukrainian forces needed precise intelligence about FSB headquarters security arrangements, Moscow air defense deployment patterns, and optimal approach vectors that could exploit gaps in coverage. They needed drones capable of navigating hundreds of kilometers through Russian territory while evading detection and interception. They needed timing coordination that ensured drones reached the target simultaneously from multiple directions to overwhelm point defenses. They needed sufficient explosive payload to cause meaningful damage despite the building's robust construction. Intelligence reports suggest Ukrainian forces used modified commercial drones enhanced with military guidance systems launched from positions deep inside Ukrainian-controlled territory. The drones flew at low altitude to avoid radar detection, used terrain-following algorithms to mask their approach, and apparently exploited spec devons. What makes this strike even more extraordinary is the psychological warfare component that extends beyond physical damage. Ukrainian forces didn't just hit the Lubyanka, they announced they would hit it days in advance through channels that ensured Russian security services received the warnings but could do nothing to prevent the attack. The advance warning transformed the strike from tactical operation into psychological torment for FSB leadership. They knew an attack was coming, they had days to prepare, they presumably enhanced security measures and air defenses, and Ukrainian drones struck successfully anyway. The message is devastating. We can hit you whenever we choose. Your defenses are inadequate, and advance warning changes nothing. Let's be honest. You cannot maintain authoritarian control when your security headquarters is struck by external enemies you claim to have deterred. You cannot project omniscience when your intelligence services cannot detect incoming attacks on their own building. You cannot instill fear in domestic opposition when your fearsome security apparatus demonstrates such obvious vulnerability. The FSB's power has always depended on perception of invincibility, on the belief that resistance is futile because the security services see everything and control everything. The Lubyanka strike demolishes that perception comprehensively. And yet, for weeks before the strike, Ukrainian intelligence apparently provided multiple warnings through various channels that FSB headquarters would be targeted, creating a fascinating psychological dynamic where Russian security services faced impossible choices. Evacuating the Lubyanka would acknowledge Ukrainian threats credibly enough to force operational changes, undermining the building's symbolic importance and admitting vulnerability. Remaining in place risked casualties and damage when the threatened strike occurred. Publicizing the threat would spread fear about Ukrainian capabilities reaching central Moscow. Suppressing information about the threat would leave FSB personnel unprepared when attack came. Every option carried costs, and Ukrainian intelligence created conditions where Russian security services had no good choices. Here's the second hook. You can operate the most sophisticated security apparatus, employ thousands of intelligence officers, surveil your own population comprehensively, but you cannot prevent external adversaries from striking your headquarters when those adversaries possess superior intelligence, innovative technology, and willingness to take operational risks that you cannot counter. That's not just security failure, that's the fundamental revelation that authoritarian security states are hollow when facing determined external pressure. Intelligence reports indicate the final moments before the Lubyanka strike featured chaos within Russian security services as multiple air defense systems detected inbound targets but could not coordinate effective response before drones reached their target. Moscow's air defense network, which includes multiple overlapping systems designed to protect the capital from aerial attack, apparently experienced electronic warfare interference that degraded radar effectiveness at crucial moments. FSB personnel in the building reported hearing air raid sirens activate only seconds before explosions, providing insufficient time for evacuation or protective measures. The strikes hit multiple sections of the building simultaneously, suggesting coordination that overwhelms security responses. The explosions themselves, while not catastrophic in terms of structural damage due to the building's robust construction, achieved significant psychological impact. Windows shattered throughout the complex, interior walls showed blast damage, personnel were injured by debris and shock waves. Most importantly, the strikes proved that Ukrainian forces could reach and damage the building that symbolizes Russian state security. The physical damage matters less than the demonstration of capability and the shattering of assumptions about Lubyanka's invulnerability. What makes this strike's aftermath even more consequential for Russia is the secondary effects on FSB operations and morale. Personnel working in the building now understand they are legitimate military targets for Ukrainian forces with demonstrated ability to strike Moscow's city center. That knowledge affects everything. Recruitment of new officers becomes more difficult when FSB headquarters itself is a target. Experienced officers may seek transfers to less exposed positions. Operational effectiveness declines as personnel focus on personal security rather than missions. The psychological burden of working in a building that Ukrainian forces have attacked and explicitly threatened to attack again degrades the FSB's capability to function effectively. Think about that. The organization responsible for ensuring Putin's regime's security, for detecting and neutralizing threats, for maintaining domestic control through fear and surveillance, cannot ensure security of its own personnel in its own headquarters in Russia's capital city. That reality fundamentally undermines the FSB's authority and effectiveness. How can Russian citizens fear an organization that cannot protect itself? How can FSB officers project confidence when they work in a building Ukrainian drones have struck? The psychological inversion is complete. Instead of the FSB making others feel vulnerable, the FSB itself is revealed as profoundly vulnerable. The genius lies not just in the strike's execution, but in the strategic messaging it communicates to multiple audiences simultaneously. To Putin and Russian leadership, the message is clear. Ukrainian capabilities can reach any target in Moscow, including the buildings where you work, and coordinate regime security. To FSB officers and Russian security personnel, the message is equally clear. Your leadership cannot protect you even in your headquarters, so why should you risk your lives carrying out their orders? To Russian citizens, particularly those who might oppose Putin's regime, the message offers hope. The fearsome security services are not invincible. Resistance is not futile. The regime's power is far more fragile than propaganda claims. Sometimes the most powerful attacks are those that force your adversary to choose between maintaining operations in vulnerable locations or abandoning symbolic positions with enormous political costs. The Lubyanka strike achieves exactly this dilemma. Russia must either continue FSB operations in the building despite proven vulnerability, risking additional Ukrainian strikes and personnel casualties, or relocate FSB headquarters to presumably safer locations, which would represent public admission of defeat and abandonment of a building central to Russian state security identity for over a century. Either choice represents strategic defeat with different costs. When you examine the Lubyanka strike's symbolism, something profoundly devastating emerges beyond immediate operational impacts. The building represents the core of Putin's authoritarian power structure, the institution that most directly enables his continued rule through surveillance, repression, and fear. Striking it successfully sends unmistakable message that no element of Putin's regime is beyond Ukrainian reach, that the apparatus sustaining his dictatorship is vulnerable to external pressure in ways that no amount of internal repression can prevent. Here's the third hook. When your security headquarters that has terrorized generations of citizens is struck by the foreign enemy you're supposedly defeating, when the symbol of untouchable state power is revealed as vulnerable target, you don't just lose a building's perceived invincibility. You lose the psychological foundation that makes authoritarian control possible, the belief that the regime's power is absolute and resistance brings only suffering. The Lubyanka has always represented more than operational headquarters. It embodies the fusion of intelligence services with state power that characterizes authoritarian regimes, the use of secret police to maintain domestic control through fear and surveillance, the willingness to employ any means including torture and murder to eliminate threats to the regime. Under Stalin, the NKVD operated from Lubyanka to coordinate the Great Terror that killed millions. Under Brezhnev, the KGB used the building to coordinate repression of dissidents throughout the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Under Putin, the FSB operates from Lubyanka to maintain his authoritarian rule through similar methods adapted to the 21st century. The symbolism of Ukrainian forces striking this particular building is impossible to ignore and deeply, profoundly haunting for Putin personally on multiple levels. He built his entire career in the KGB, served in its Foreign Intelligence Directorate, and has explicitly and repeatedly identified his KGB background as absolutely formative to his worldview, his understanding of power, and his approach to leadership and governance. When Putin rose to power in the late 1990s through murky circumstances that remain controversial, one of his very first actions as president was systematically strengthening the successor FSB and elevating former KGB colleagues and associates to positions of enormous power throughout Russian government, security services, and state-owned enterprises. Putin's regime is fundamentally and inescapably a security services regime, built consciously on KGB traditions and operational methods, sustained through FSB operations coordinated from the Lubyanka, dependent on surveillance and repression that radiates outward from this central node. The historical echoes are haunting in their clarity and completeness. Ukrainian forces attacking the Lubyanka strikes directly at Putin's personal history and the institutional foundation of his power. This isn't attacking a random government building. It's attacking the organization Putin led, the institution he relies upon to maintain control, the place that most represents his approach to governance through security service dominance. The psychological impact on Putin personally must be extraordinary. The organization he built his career in, that he expected would protect his regime, cannot protect even itself from Ukrainian military action. The irony is devastating and impossible to miss. Putin justified invading Ukraine partly by claiming Ukrainian leadership was fascist and terrorist, that Ukrainian forces targeted civilians, that Russia needed to conduct special military operation to neutralize these threats. But Ukrainian forces have struck legitimate military and security targets, including the headquarters of the organization that coordinates Russian state terror against its own citizens. The FSB, which has arrested thousands for anti-war speech, tortured prisoners in detention, and coordinated assassinations abroad, has proven far more vulnerable than Ukrainian military forces defending their country. The claimed terrorists struck the actual terrorists' headquarters. What makes this symbolism even more powerful is the visual record of the strike that Russian censors cannot completely suppress. Videos from numerous angles showing smoke rising from Lubyanka, photos of damaged sections of the building, witness accounts spreading through social media despite government attempts at information control. All of this creates lasting imagery that undermines regime propaganda. Russians see with their own eyes that the FSB headquarters was struck, that Ukrainian forces reached central Moscow, that the building representing state security suffered damage. No amount of propaganda can unsee what citizens have witnessed. Think about that. Russian citizens who grew up fearing the Lubyanka, who internalized that the security services were all-powerful and resistance futile, now watch Ukrainian drones strike the building successfully. That experience fundamentally alters psychological calculations about regime power. If the FSB headquarters can be hit, what else that seemed untouchable is actually vulnerable? The symbolic crack in the regime's facade of invincibility becomes psychological opportunity for those who might resist. Symbols outlast explosions and reshape consciousness. The Lubyanka strike will persist in Russian historical memory as the moment when Ukrainian forces proved they could reach the symbolic heart of Putin's security state, when the institution that terrorized generations revealed its vulnerability, when the mythology of FSB omnipotence collapsed under pressure of demonstrated Ukrainian capability. Future Russians resisting authoritarian rule will reference the Lubyanka strike as proof that seemingly invincible power structures contain fatal weaknesses exploitable by determined adversaries. The human mind is the first battlefield, and the Lubyanka strike delivers psychological blows that cascade through Russian security apparatus and society more broadly. For FSB personnel throughout Russia, the strike creates existential questions about organizational competence and personal safety. Officers who believed working for state security provided protection now understand they've made themselves targets. The prestige that once accompanied FSB employment now carries the burden of being associated with an organization Ukrainian forces successfully attacked in its own headquarters. Here's the fourth hook. When a regime built on security service dominance watches its security headquarters struck by external enemies, psychological impact radiates through every element of the apparatus. Personnel question whether the organization can protect them when it cannot protect itself. Citizens question whether they should fear an institution revealed as vulnerable. International observers question whether the regime itself is as secure as it claims when its security organs are so exposed. For Russian military personnel already demoralized by battlefield failures in Ukraine, the Lubyanka strike provides additional evidence that Russian institutions across the board are failing. The military cannot win the war. The air defenses cannot protect Moscow. The security services cannot secure their own headquarters. The pattern of comprehensive institutional failure becomes undeniable. That pattern affects military morale, recruitment, retention, and ultimately combat effectiveness as soldiers question whether they're serving competent leadership or a failing regime. The psychological warfare extends to Putin's inner circle, the oligarchs and officials whose power depends on Putin's continued rule. The Lubyanka strike demonstrates that Ukrainian forces can hit targets in central Moscow, raising uncomfortable questions about whether Putin himself might be vulnerable to similar strikes. If Ukrainian drones can reach FSB headquarters, can they reach the Kremlin? Can they reach Putin's residences? Can they reach the locations where Russia's elite believe themselves secure? These questions create paranoia and insecurity among those who previously felt protected by regime power. Think about that. Authoritarian regimes maintain control partly through elites' belief that supporting the dictator provides security and prosperity. The Lubyanka strike undermines both beliefs. The security cannot be guaranteed when Ukrainian forces reach central Moscow. The prosperity derived from Putin's regime seems less valuable when the regime appears vulnerable to defeat. Russian elites must recalculate whether continued Putin support serves their interests when his war has brought consequences that threaten their safety. Image is everything in authoritarian politics, and the Lubyanka strike devastates Putin's carefully constructed image as strong leader who protects Russia from external threats. The visual of smoke rising from FSB headquarters, the undeniable evidence that Ukrainian forces struck successfully, the forced admission through silence that Russian defenses failed, all of this demolishes propaganda narratives about Russian strength and invincibility more effectively than any Ukrainian statement or Western criticism possibly could. Something deeper than security operations is unfolding throughout Russia, something that cannot be measured in damaged buildings or casualties sustained. It's a fundamental shift in understanding of whether Putin's regime can survive the catastrophic consequences of his Ukrainian invasion, whether institutions that sustain his rule are so degraded they cannot accomplish basic missions, whether the mythology of Russian state power has any remaining substance when tested by determined external adversary. For decades, Russian and Soviet regimes relied on security services as the ultimate guarantor of power, the institution that ensured regime survival regardless of economic conditions, military setbacks, or popular discontent. The security services could suppress internal dissent, eliminate external threats, and maintain control through comprehensive surveillance and targeted repression. This model worked for generations because the security services themselves were perceived as invulnerable, as the one institution that no force could challenge successfully. The Lubyanka strike demolishes this assumption at its foundation. When security services cannot secure themselves, when their headquarters is struck by external enemies, when their personnel become targets rather than hunters, the entire model of security service-sustained authoritarianism reveals its fatal vulnerability. If the FSB cannot protect itself, how can it protect Putin? If it cannot secure its headquarters, how can it secure the regime? These questions have no satisfactory answers, and their existence creates doubt throughout the apparatus that sustains Putin's rule. Think about that. For the first time since Putin consolidated power in the early 2000s, Russian security services face an adversary they cannot intimidate, surveil comprehensively, or eliminate through traditional methods. Ukrainian forces operate beyond FSB jurisdiction, cannot be arrested or disappeared, possess capabilities that threaten FSB operations even in Moscow, and enjoy international support that makes them resilient to Russian pressure. This represents an existential challenge to FSB operational model and organizational identity. Western responses to the Lubyanka strike have been carefully calibrated but privately supportive. NATO members cannot explicitly endorse attacks on security service headquarters without complicating diplomatic positions, but intelligence agencies quietly confirm that such operations are strategically effective and represent legitimate targeting under laws of armed conflict. Public statements emphasize Ukraine's right to defend itself while avoiding specific discussion of strikes inside Moscow. Private intelligence sharing likely includes detailed information about Russian security service vulnerabilities and optimal targeting strategies. The implications extend beyond immediate psychological impact. If Ukrainian forces can strike FSB headquarters, what prevents strikes on other Russian government buildings, infrastructure, or leadership targets? The entire Russian government must now operate under assumption that Ukrainian capabilities reach throughout Moscow and no facility is truly secure. This forces expensive security enhancements, operational disruptions as facilities are hardened or relocated, and psychological burden on personnel who understand they work in potential target zones. So tonight, as damage is assessed at Lubyanka and FSB directors contemplate their organization's vulnerability, remember this carefully. We're witnessing the systematic demolition of assumptions that have sustained Putin's authoritarian rule for over 2 decades. The security services that were supposed to be omniscient have been repeatedly surprised. The defenses that were supposed to protect Moscow have been repeatedly penetrated. The building that symbolized untouchable state power has been struck by the foreign enemy Russia invaded, expecting easy conquest. Power is being redefined from authoritarian control to vulnerability under external pressure. Russia's security state, impressive on paper and terrifying to domestic opponents, has proven inadequate when facing determined international adversary with innovative capabilities and sustained support from democratic nations. The apparatus that sustained Putin's rule becomes liability as its failures multiply and its inadequacy becomes undeniable. When historians examine this war decades from now, the Lubyanka strike will occupy special place as the operation that proved Ukrainian forces could reach any target in Moscow, that security services could not protect even themselves, that the mythology of Russian state power was hollow propaganda, masking profound institutional decay. The strike that damaged one building exposed vulnerabilities throughout the entire regime structure. You cannot maintain authoritarian control when your security apparatus is revealed as vulnerable to external attack. You cannot project invincibility when Ukrainian drones strike your security headquarters in broad daylight. And you cannot sustain regime based on fear and repression when the institution responsible for generating fear is itself afraid, when the organization conducting repression cannot protect its own personnel from retaliation. The Lubyanka has been struck. The FSB headquarters that terrorized generations bears damage from Ukrainian military action. And the foundation of Putin's authoritarian rule, security service dominance sustained through fear of invincible state apparatus, has been revealed as brittle and vulnerable, unable to accomplish its most basic mission of protecting regime institutions from external enemies Russia created through its catastrophic invasion. Freedom fights back by striking the institutions that sustain oppression, demonstrating that secret police headquarters are no more invulnerable than the people they terrorize. The yellow brick building at Lubyanka Square, symbol of unchecked state power for over a century, now bears scars from Ukrainian military action that prove no institution sustaining Putin's war is beyond reach, no target in Moscow is truly secure, and the apparatus of authoritarian control is vulnerable in ways that fundamentally undermine its capacity to function. The security services are insecure. The protected cannot protect themselves. And Russian citizens watch, wondering what other myths about regime power might collapse when tested by Ukrainian determination. That's where we leave it tonight. FSB headquarters struck, security services revealed as vulnerable, and Putin's authoritarian apparatus exposed as inadequate against external adversaries it cannot intimidate, surveil, or eliminate through methods that worked against domestic opposition. The war has reached the heart of Russian security state, and the heart is vulnerable. I'm Maddow. Thank you for being here. Stay informed, and good night.